Fateful winter. Winter in London always carries a sense of both grandeur and solitude. The Christmas lights still twinkle along the old streets, reflecting on the pavement drenched by the persistent drizzle. People rush past one another, long coats rustling in the cold wind, creating a rhythm of the city's characteristic bustle. At the Whitmore Grand Hotel, Beatrice Bennett had just finished an intense meeting. She returned to her room, intending to spend a quiet afternoon resting, completely unaware that fate had arranged for her an encounter she could never have foreseen. The door swung open. She turned around, startled. A tall man stepped in, absent-mindedly pulling his phone from his coat pocket, oblivious to the fact that this was not his room. "Excuse me, you've entered the wrong room." Beatrice's voice rang out, filled with suspicion. The man froze. He lifted his gaze, and suddenly the world stood still. Beatrice, standing before Henry Whitmore, was not just a stranger, it was her, the one he had searched for over the past 10 years, the one he had lost. Beatrice went rigid. "Henry?" Her voice cracked. Impossible. The man standing before her, with those deep eyes and familiar features, was the very person she had once loved, and the one who had vanished from her life without a word. The air in the room grew heavy. Their breaths echoed in the tense silence. They stared at each other. Too many questions, too many unspoken words. 10 years. 10 years she had spent trying to forget. 10 years he had spent searching in vain. 10 years they had lost each other. And now they stood face to face, as if fate had finally decided it was time to confront the past. Henry couldn't breathe. His heart pounded so fiercely he felt as if his entire body was trembling. He had imagined this moment hundreds, thousands of times in his head. During lonely nights in New York, staring out of high-rise windows, drowning in regret. During countless business trips through different cities, always hoping that just once, he might glimpse her face among the sea of people. He had walked the old streets of Oxfordshire, where they had played as children, hoping to find some trace of her. He had asked old acquaintances, searched her name online, but found nothing. Beatrice Bennett had completely disappeared from his world, until today. She was here, right in front of him, no longer a shadow from the past, no longer a distant memory. She was real. She was real. Something inside Henry suddenly shattered. He wanted to say something, wanted to ask her why she had disappeared, wanted to tell her he had been searching for her all these years, wanted to know if she had ever thought of him the way he had thought of her, but all he could do was stand there. Beatrice couldn't breathe either. All this time she had believed Henry was a part of her past. She had told herself to forget him. She had thought she would never see him again, but he was here, in the flesh. She didn't know whether to feel happy, sad, or to run away. Because if this was a dream, she wasn't sure she wanted to wake up. They just stood there looking at each other, as if the world around them no longer existed. As if time had rewound itself. As if 10 years of separation had never happened. And then Henry slowly reached out, as if afraid that if he didn't hold on to her this very moment, she would disappear again. "Is it really you?" he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. Beatrice nodded slightly, her lips quivering. "It's me." And in that moment, Henry knew he would never let her go again. Welcome to Soul Stories. Booker. Life can be overwhelming, but here we share heartfelt tales to bring you peace, joy, and inspiration. Your support, every comment, like, and follow, means the world to us. It motivates us to create more meaningful and uplifting stories just for you. Did our latest story touch your heart? Leave a "I am happy" in the comments if you agree. Subscribe now and be part of a community that spreads love, kindness, and positivity. Let's make every day a little brighter, together. Beatrice tightened her grip on the coffee cup in her hands, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Henry Whitmore. That name rang in her ears like a distant echo, faint yet painfully clear. Before her was no longer the mischievous boy who used to flash his carefree smile while running barefoot through the vast fields of Oxfordshire. Instead, she faced a grown man, tall, strong, exuding power and authority. Yet his eyes, those same piercing blue eyes, still held the familiar gentleness she had once known so well. Henry, too, was frozen in place. He couldn't look away from her. Beatrice still bore the same delicate features that had lived in his memories. But something was different. Once she had been the girl who laughed easily, her eyes as clear as the summer sky. Now she seemed calmer, more composed. Yet within those eyes there was something that made his breath hitch. A quiet sorrow, a wound that had never healed. Henry was the first to break the silence. "Bea, I never expected to see you here." His voice was hoarse. Beatrice clenched her fingers, willing herself to stay composed. "What are you doing here?" Henry glanced at the door, then down at the keycard in his hand. He blinked, as if just realizing his mistake. "I thought this was my room." Beatrice let out a soft laugh, a laugh devoid of humor. "What a coincidence, isn't it?" They looked at each other, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to slip backward. More than 10 years ago, they had been two carefree children growing up together amidst the endless green fields of Oxfordshire. Beatrice remembered the summer afternoons when she and Henry would run along the banks of the Thames, leaving behind tiny footprints in the soft earth. When the golden wheat fields swayed in the wind, they would sit beneath the ancient oak tree, reading books Henry had secretly taken from his father's library. "One day I'll run my family's company," Henry had once said as they lay on the grass, watching the clouds drift by. "And what about me?" Beatrice had asked, turning her head to look at her best friend. "You can be anything you want." Henry had smiled, plucking a wildflower and tucking it into her hair. "But whatever it is, I know I'll always be by your side." It was a promise made with the certainty of a child who had never known what it meant to lose someone. Back then, they had believed the world was vast, but nothing could ever separate them. But the world was not as simple as childhood dreams. Everything changed when Henry turned 17. His father had decided to move their entire family to the United States to expand the business. Beatrice couldn't believe it when she heard the news. You can't leave," she had told Henry on the night before he flew to New York. They stood beneath the old oak tree by the Thames, the place where they had shared so many memories. Beatrice looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I'll come back, I promise." Henry had taken her hand, his fingers warm. Whether to reassure her or himself, he wasn't sure. "I'll write to you, and one day I'll find my way back to you." Beatrice had believed him. She had believed in Henry, in his promise, in their friendship, and in the young love between them. But time moved forward. Beatrice wrote letters. At first, she received a few in return. Then they became fewer and fewer, until eventually there were none. Each time Henry received a letter, he had meant to reply. But business, the pressure from his father, and his new life in America had consumed him. Everything had begun to slip through his fingers. By the time he realized it, Beatrice was no longer where she used to be. And just like that, they had lost each other. Reunion after 10 years. Now Henry stood right in front of her, and Beatrice felt all those memories crashing over her like a tidal wave. She still remembered the feeling of waiting for each letter, the sinking disappointment when she realized there would be no more, the quiet despair when she understood that Henry was never coming back. And yet here he was, standing before her as if time had never passed. "Have you been well?" Henry asked, his gaze filled with emotion. Beatrice took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm fine. What about you?" But she knew she was lying. Henry let out a soft chuckle. "Not entirely fine, if you want the truth," he admitted. "I tried to find you, but it seems fate didn't want us to meet again too soon." Beatrice didn't respond. She wasn't sure if she could believe those words. Time had changed them. It had pulled them into two different worlds. But as she looked into Henry's eyes, she couldn't deny that a part of her heart had never truly let him go. They sat down at a small table in the corner of the cafe. Beatrice's coffee had grown cold in her hands, but she no longer had the mind to drink it. The unexpected reunion with Henry had brought back a flood of memories she thought had been buried. Yet at the same time, it made her realize an undeniable truth. They were no longer the naive children from Oxfordshire. 10 years was a long time. She had grown up. She had changed. And so had Henry. Once upon a time, Beatrice had dreamed of adventures, of becoming a writer or an artist. But life didn't always follow the plans we made. When Henry left and never returned, she had endured years of loneliness and uncertainty. Without him by her side, she had to learn to be strong. After graduating from university, Beatrice chose a different path from many of her peers. She didn't chase fame or wealth. Instead, she devoted her heart to those society had forgotten. Now she was the director of Horizon, a small, nonprofit center in London dedicated to helping underprivileged children, the abandoned, the orphaned, the ones with no one to protect them. Every day she worked to raise funds, organize classes, find sponsors, and ensure the children had a place to call home. Her work wasn't easy. She faced financial struggles, bureaucratic red tape, and exhaustion that sometimes made her want to give up. But every time she saw the children smile, she knew it was all worth it. Beatrice had no regrets. But she also knew that the world she lived in, a world full of hardship and scarcity, was far removed from Henry's. Henry Whitmore, the boy who once lay in the grass reading books with her, was now a successful man, a formidable businessman. After leaving England, he had been swept into the cold, calculated world of his family's financial empire. Henry had no choice. He had been raised to inherit Whitmore and Sons, one of the most powerful financial firms in the country. He had once hated it, but when his father fell ill, duty forced him to take over the company, and as the days passed, he realized he was sinking deeper and deeper into that world. His life revolved around numbers, billion-dollar deals, and extravagant parties with the elite. People spoke his name with admiration. Business magazines hailed him as a young phenomenon in the financial industry. But behind all the glamour, he felt empty. Everything he had achieved was impressive, yet he had never felt like any of it truly belonged to him. And now, standing before Beatrice, Henry realized the distance between them was far greater than he had ever imagined. Two opposite worlds. Beatrice looked at Henry. He was impeccable in his tailored suit, exuding the calm confidence of a businessman. Everything about him radiated wealth, success, and power. And her? She often wore simple clothes, practical for working with the children. Every day she worried about securing enough funding to keep the center running, while Henry could sign a check without a second thought. She remembered the nights she had spent struggling to keep Horizon from shutting down, the countless hours she stayed up writing grant applications, hoping for support. And Henry? He lived in a world of enormous numbers, where a single dinner could cost as much as her center's entire yearly budget. She swallowed hard, feeling a sudden wave of self-consciousness. "I suppose we've changed a lot," Beatrice murmured, her eyes fixed on the coffee cup in front of her. Henry was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. "But some things never change." Beatrice looked up and met his gaze. Henry was looking at her the same way he always had, like the boy who once promised never to leave her. Something inside her wavered, but then reality pulled her back. They had changed. They were no longer the carefree children running through the fields of Oxfordshire. They belonged to two different worlds now, and perhaps, once again, they were nothing more than two lines crossing for a brief moment, only to continue in separate directions. Henry Whitmore couldn't sleep that night. After their unexpected reunion at the hotel, Beatrice's image lingered in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the way she had looked at him, her gaze a mix of surprise, nostalgia, and a hint of hesitation. She was still as beautiful as he remembered, but she was no longer the shy girl from his past. Beatrice had changed in ways he had never imagined, and that only made him want to know more. The next morning, Henry asked his assistant to find out everything about Beatrice. It didn't take long before he had the details about Horizon, the non-profit organization she ran. By sunrise, he was already on his way there. Horizon was located in an old neighborhood in South London, just a short distance from the towering skyscrapers of the financial district. Yet it felt like an entirely different world. The three-story building had a classic charm, though the exterior paint was peeling in places. In the front yard, a few children were playing, their laughter ringing through the crisp morning air. Henry stepped inside, and the first thing he saw was her. Beatrice was kneeling down, tying the shoelaces of a little boy who looked no older than 6. She leaned in, listening intently as the boy whispered something to her, then let out a soft laugh, ruffling his hair affectionately. Henry stood frozen, watching the scene unfold before him. He had never seen Beatrice like this before. She was no longer the shy girl trailing after him in the fields of Oxfordshire, no longer the girl who used to gaze out the window whenever it rained. Now she was a strong, independent woman, a woman who had found her purpose, and Henry felt his heart stir, not because of old memories, but because of the woman she had become. Beatrice felt a familiar gaze on her. When she looked up, her heart stilled for a moment. Henry, he stood there amidst the children, completely out of place in his expensive suit. She wasn't surprised he had found his way here. Henry had always been persistent when he wanted something, but she hadn't expected him to try to step into her life again. "What are you doing here?" She stood up, crossing her arms over her chest. "I came to see your work." Henry took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't need to do that. Your world and mine aren't the same." Beatrice's voice was firm, carefully controlled. Henry smiled slightly. "Then show me how they're different." "Henry, you don't need to interfere in my life." She knew she was trying to create distance. She knew that if she let him in, he might make her remember emotions she had worked so hard to bury. Henry looked at her, his blue eyes unwavering. "I'm not here because of the past." He took another step closer, closing the space between them. "I'm here because of you, Beatrice." Her heartbeat quickened, but she couldn't let herself waver. She had once believed in Henry, she had once waited for him, and in the end, she had learned how to live without him. She couldn't let history repeat itself. "Henry, you don't understand. This is my life. It's nothing like the world you know." "Then help me understand." Henry tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. "Give me a chance." Beatrice said nothing. She wasn't sure she could stop him, but she knew one thing. If she let him stay, her heart might start to feel something again, and that was what scared her the most. The next morning, Beatrice thought Henry had given up, but she was wrong. For the first time in years, Henry Whitmore decided that no one would tell him what he should or shouldn't do, and this time, he wasn't just coming to Horizon to see Beatrice. He was coming to help. 3 days after their first meeting, Beatrice was outside the center, organizing some paperwork, when she heard the familiar sound of a car engine. She looked up. A sleek black luxury car pulled up in front of the gate, and from inside, Henry stepped out. This time he wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit. Instead, he had on a simple gray sweater, looking noticeably more at ease, yet still carrying the unmistakable aura of a man who belonged to a different world. Beatrice crossed her arms. "What are you here for this time? Another social visit?" Henry smiled, but there was a determined glint in his eyes. "I'm here to work." "Work?" Beatrice raised an eyebrow, half skeptical. "I want to help." His gaze was steady. "Whether you like it or not, I'm here." Beatrice sighed. She didn't want to admit it, but deep down she knew she couldn't stop him. Henry had never been the type to walk away easily. "Fine," she said with a shrug, "but if you want to help, you do it my way." "Then show me how." Henry's voice was sincere. In the days that followed, Henry officially became a part of Horizon. He started with the simplest tasks: sorting paperwork, organizing the food pantry, assisting at fundraising events. At first, the staff at the center were cautious about his presence, but over time, they realized he wasn't just here to make an appearance. Henry wasn't afraid to roll up his sleeves. He didn't hesitate to get his hands dirty. He didn't just listen to the children's stories. He genuinely cared. Beatrice still kept her distance, but she couldn't deny one thing. She was getting used to having him around. Some nights they worked late together, and no matter how much she protested, Henry always insisted on driving her home. At first, Beatrice tried to keep things strictly professional, but slowly she realized she was laughing more when he was around. One time, Henry spilled an entire bucket of water while trying to mop the floor, sending the kids into fits of laughter. "Are you sure you used to run a billion-dollar company?" Beatrice teased, struggling to hold back a smile. "I know how to calculate investment returns, not how to clean floors," Henry admitted, looking helpless. Beatrice couldn't help but laugh. For the first time in a long while, she felt lighthearted. Another time, one of the children grabbed Henry's arm and started doodling all over his expensive sweater with colorful markers. Henry glanced down at the mess, then simply chuckled. Well, now you look like an art investor, Beatrice joked. Who knows? This might be worth millions someday, Henry said with a wink. Beatrice laughed, genuinely, freely. And in that moment, she realized something. Henry wasn't just a memory from her past. He was becoming a part of her present. Fate had separated them once. Would it do so again? That night, after all the work was done and the children were asleep, Beatrice and Henry walked through the quiet streets of London. The wind was sharp and cold, but she didn't feel it. Her heart was pounding too fast. Henry slowed his steps, then stopped entirely. "We need to talk," he said, his voice hoarse, as if he had been holding back for too long. Beatrice took a deep breath, her gaze falling to the cobblestone pavement. "Henry, the past is behind us." "But I'm still living in it," he interrupted, his blue eyes burning with resolve. Beatrice shut her eyes, gripping her scarf tightly as if trying to steady herself. "Do you think I haven't lived in that past too?" Her voice wavered. "Do you think I forgot? Do you know how many letters I wrote to you over the years?" Henry froze. Beatrice let out a quiet, hollow laugh, one that carried no joy. "I wrote so many letters, Henry, but I never sent them." He stared at her, as if trying to decipher every word she said. "Why?" His voice was raw, almost desperate. Beatrice lifted her gaze, and for the first time, she let him see the pain she had buried for so long. "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid of being disappointed again," she whispered. "Do you remember when I wrote to you, and you never wrote back? I was scared that if I sent another letter, I would finally have to face the truth, that you had forgotten me, that you had moved on, that you had built a life where there was no place for me." Henry's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't know. She had no idea that he had spent years searching for her. "Beatrice?" He exhaled, his hands clenching unconsciously. "I never forgot you, not for a single day." Beatrice let out a quiet scoff, but her eyes held uncertainty. "How can I believe that when you never came back?" Henry met her gaze head on, his emotions no longer concealed. "Because I did come back." Beatrice's breath caught. "What?" "I came back, Beatrice." Henry's voice was slow, deliberate, each word cutting through him like a blade. "Just a few months after moving to the U.S., I realized I couldn't bear being without you, so I flew back." Beatrice felt the world tilt beneath her feet. But I wasn't there." Henry nodded, his expression shadowed with old pain. "No, you weren't. When I returned to Oxfordshire, you were gone." "That's not possible," she murmured, her hands trembling. She had waited. She had hoped. But the moment he came back, she was no longer there. "I looked for you," Henry continued, his voice lowering. "I asked the neighbors, our teachers, everyone I could think of. But no one knew where you had gone." Beatrice felt a lump rise in her throat. I moved to London to live with my aunt after my mother passed away," she whispered. "I didn't leave any trace because I thought there was nothing left to wait for." Henry inhaled sharply. "I was desperate to find you," he admitted. "I went to all the places we used to go, hoping you would return. But you never did. I even wrote letters to your old address, but none of them were ever answered." Beatrice stood motionless. For years she had believed that Henry had never come back, but the truth was, he had come back. Fate had simply torn them apart once more. Henry took a step closer, his hand instinctively reaching for her, but hesitating in midair, as if afraid she would vanish again. "I never stopped looking for you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every time I traveled to a new city, I hoped I would see you in a crowd. Every time I caught a glimpse of a girl with long brown hair, my heart would race, only for me to be disappointed again." "Henry," Beatrice whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. He let out a soft, bitter laugh. "And then, on an ordinary day in the middle of London, I walked into a cafe, and you were there." He took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers. "Do you know what that moment felt like?" Beatrice shook her head, her silent tears falling freely now. Henry stepped even closer, his voice soft yet powerful. "It felt like I could finally breathe again." They stood there, in the middle of a bustling London street, yet it felt like they were the only two people in the world. 10 years. 10 years apart, 10 years searching, and finally they had found each other. Not in a dream, not in faded memories, but here, in this moment. Henry's voice was steady, resolute. "I won't lose you again." Beatrice looked into his eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her. A flicker of belief, fragile yet undeniable. But beneath it all, fear still gnawed at her. Henry could be here now, but what about the future? He belonged to a world of billion-dollar deals, extravagant galas, and numbers she could never comprehend. No matter how much she wanted to believe in this moment, she knew, sooner or later, he would leave again. Could she ever step into his world? Or would she just be another fleeting presence in his life? Beatrice wasn't sure if her heart could survive losing him a second time. The time Henry spent at Horizon did not pass peacefully. As soon as news of his presence at the charity center reached the Whitmore family, everything changed. That morning, Henry was helping Beatrice organize the financial records in the center's office when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. A familiar number. His mother. "What is it, Mother?" Henry answered, his voice calm. "Henry, what on earth are you doing?" Lady Whitmore's sharp voice cut through the line, skipping any formalities. "All of London is talking about how you've been spending time at some rundown charity instead of focusing on the company. Do you have any idea what this is doing to the family's reputation?" Henry tightened his grip on the phone. He had expected this reaction. "I don't care about reputation. I'm just helping a friend." "A friend?" his mother scoffed. "Beatrice Bennett? An insignificant girl running an unheard-of charity? Are you joking, Henry? Where do you think this is going?" Henry sighed, trying to keep his irritation in check. "Mother, I'm an adult. I can make my own decisions." "No, you cannot. This family has responsibilities, traditions, and I will not let a girl like Beatrice ruin your future." "You don't get to decide who I have in my life." Henry's voice was firm. "Then perhaps you've forgotten that I've already found the perfect match for you." Henry frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Charlotte Kensington has just returned from Paris, and you know very well, she is the ideal choice." Henry went rigid. Charlotte Kensington returns. Charlotte Kensington was the daughter of an old aristocratic family. Beautiful, intelligent, and perfect by high society standards. She had long been the woman Henry's family wanted him to marry, but Henry had never truly paid her any attention. And now Charlotte was back in London. Not long after his mother's call, Henry received a message from Charlotte, inviting him to dinner for a catch-up. He knew all too well that this was a carefully arranged meeting, but Henry didn't expect Charlotte to take things even further. On a cold afternoon, Beatrice was tidying up the children's toys in the yard when a luxurious Bentley pulled up in front of Horizon. A woman stepped out, Charlotte Kensington. She was stunning, poised, her golden hair cascading in perfect waves, wrapped in an expensive Burberry coat. As she approached, the sharp clicks of her high heels echoed against the pavement. Her gaze, cold and assessing, locked onto Beatrice. Beatrice immediately sensed the confrontation in those eyes. "Are you Beatrice Bennett?" Charlotte's voice was crisp, authoritative. "Yes, I am." Beatrice remained calm. Charlotte gave a thin smile. "I'm Charlotte Kensington. I assume you've heard of me." Beatrice didn't respond, but she knew she didn't need to. She already understood exactly who Charlotte was and why she was here. Charlotte stepped closer, crossing her arms. "I'll get straight to the point," she said coolly. "You don't belong in Henry's world." Beatrice froze for a second but kept her composure. "I'm not sure what you mean." Charlotte let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no warmth in it. "Oh, you know exactly what I mean, Beatrice. Henry is the heir to one of the largest financial empires in England. And you." She glanced around the modest charity center, her expression unreadable. "You run a tiny nonprofit with no real future. Do you honestly think you can hold on to him?" Beatrice clenched her fists. "If Henry is free to choose, I don't think this is any of your business." Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "Do you really think this will last?" She tilted her head slightly as if assessing a challenger. "You are nothing more than a fleeting distraction. Henry will not throw everything away for you." Beatrice's chest tightened at those words. "Then you don't know Henry as well as you think you do," she replied. though her voice had lost some of its initial strength. Charlotte caught the hesitation. She smirked, a knowing, almost victorious smile. "Do you really believe you're special, Beatrice?" Her voice was almost taunting. "Do you think Henry will choose you over his family, his reputation, and his entire future?" Beatrice said nothing, because in that moment, doubt began to creep into her heart. Did she really belong in Henry's world? Was she truly important enough for him to sacrifice everything? She had been left behind once before. Could she risk it happening again? Charlotte seemed to recognize the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Satisfied, she gave a polite, graceful nod before turning away, leaving Beatrice standing there, alone with the flood of questions and fears now unraveling in her heart. That night, Beatrice sat alone in her office, staring out the window. Outside, London remained as lively as ever, but in her heart, the world seemed to slow down. She replayed every moment with Henry, his persistence, his smile, the way he looked at her with such undeniable sincerity. But then Charlotte's words echoed in her mind. "You don't belong in Henry's world." Beatrice clenched her hands. Should she leave? Should she end this before it was too late? She didn't know. But for the first time since reuniting with Henry, she was afraid. The growing distance. Beatrice sat in her small office at Horizon, her gaze silently drifting out the window. Outside, the children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying through the crisp London air. But inside, she felt no peace. She couldn't shake the memory of her encounter with Charlotte Kensington. Charlotte hadn't needed to say much. No threats, no insults. She had simply appeared, elegant, refined, so impeccably perfect that Beatrice suddenly felt like an outsider. She had once believed she could fight against prejudice, that she could trust in what she and Henry had. But after seeing Charlotte next to him, she realized something. They belonged to the same world and she did not. Henry might not care about those boundaries, but was love strong enough for him to truly give up everything for her? And if she kept holding on, was she only leading him down a path with no future? The thought weighed heavily on her. In the days that followed, she began to pull away. When Henry came to the center, she found ways to stay busier than usual, spending more time with the staff, going on field visits, organizing events, anything to avoid facing him. She didn't want to meet his gaze, filled with honesty and conviction, because she knew if she let herself look too long, she wouldn't be able to keep pushing him away. "Beatrice, Henry's here to see you," one of the staff members, Lydia, said softly when she saw him standing outside. Beatrice tightened her grip on the stack of documents in her hands. "Tell him I'm busy, but he said he just wants to see you for a moment." "I'm very busy, Lydia." Her voice was sharper than necessary, making the younger woman pause before nodding hesitantly. Beatrice remained still, listening to Lydia's footsteps as she walked away. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Henry." She knew he wouldn't give up easily, but she couldn't let herself fall deeper into something that might only end in heartbreak. At first, Henry didn't think much of her distance. He assumed Beatrice was simply overwhelmed with work, that she needed more time. But then, when his calls went unanswered, when his messages received only brief responses, he knew something had changed. Late one night, sitting in his apartment, Henry dialed her number again. Once, twice, 3 times. She didn't pick up. He leaned back in his chair, gripping his phone tightly. Beatrice had never been one to stay silent like this. She was avoiding him, and that realization clenched painfully around his heart. Henry wasn't a fool. He had noticed her avoiding him, seen how she always found an excuse to stay busy whenever he visited the center. She was trying to push him away. But why? Was it because of Charlotte? Because of his family? Or because she didn't believe in them? Henry had never been one to give up easily. He had searched for Beatrice for 10 years. And now that he had found her, he wouldn't lose her again. Not without knowing the real reason. He stood up, grabbed his coat. If Beatrice didn't want to see him, then he would go to her, and this time he wouldn't let her run away. That night, a crisis struck. Beatrice felt an unbearable weight in her chest. She was still lost in her thoughts when her phone suddenly rang. It was a call from Horizon. She answered immediately and a panicked voice came through the line. "Beatrice, it's Tommy. He's had an accident." Beatrice froze. Without hesitation, she rushed to the hospital. Meanwhile, Henry arrived at Horizon looking for her. Lydia informed him about Tommy's accident and that Beatrice was at the hospital with him. In that same conversation, Lydia mentioned Charlotte's visit. It was all Henry needed to understand the situation. He had to prove to Beatrice that his love for her was real, that nothing, not his family, not society, not even fate, could stand in the way of what he felt for her. An unexpected tragedy. Tommy was one of the children Beatrice cared for most at Horizon. At just 8 years old, he was small and frail, but he had the brightest smile. He had been at the center since he was 5, abandoned on Horizon's doorstep on a freezing winter night. Beatrice sprinted out of her office, hailed a taxi, and rushed to the hospital. By the time she arrived, Tommy had already been taken into emergency care. The doctors informed her that he had been hit by a car while crossing the street to buy sweets with his friends. His injuries were severe, especially a head trauma. "We need to perform surgery immediately," the doctor said, "but the cost will be significant." Beatrice bit her lip hard. Horizon was always struggling financially. They scraped by month to month, barely managing to keep the center running. She knew the surgery would require an enormous sum of money, far more than Horizon could afford on such short notice. She grasped Tommy's tiny hand, tears falling onto his pale cheeks. "I'll find a way, Tommy, I promise." But how? She had already exhausted every potential source of funding, reached out to donors, and pleaded for help. But the amount needed was simply too large, and without immediate payment, the hospital wouldn't proceed with the surgery. For the first time in a long while, Beatrice felt utterly powerless, a shocking revelation. The next morning, she returned to the hospital, her mind in turmoil. She still hadn't found a way to save Tommy. But as she approached the reception desk, she was met with news that left her stunned. "The medical bills have been fully paid." "What?" Beatrice couldn't believe her ears. "A man came in early this morning and settled the entire cost. He didn't leave a name, just said that it was his responsibility." Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. She already knew who it was. She rushed straight to Horizon, and as she had expected, Henry was there, standing in her office, as if he had known she would come looking for him. "It was you, wasn't it?" Beatrice's voice trembled. Henry didn't deny it. Instead, he simply said, "A life is more important than anything else, isn't it?" Beatrice clenched her fists. "Henry, I can't let you do this. That was an enormous amount of money." "Beatrice," Henry cut her off, his voice steady. His eyes held nothing but certainty. "I don't need your gratitude. I don't need you to feel guilty. I just need to know that Tommy will be okay." A lump formed in Beatrice's throat. She knew that for Henry, money was never the issue. But what truly moved her was how he had done it, without seeking recognition, without expecting anything in return. Simply because he cared. Henry thought that this time he could choose his own path. But he had underestimated his family. The moment he paid Tommy's medical bills, Lady Whitmore found out, and she was far from pleased. That evening, Henry received a call from his mother, demanding that he return to the Whitmore estate immediately. When he stepped into the grand living room, Lady Whitmore was already there, poised, elegant, but with eyes as cold as ice. She didn't waste time. "Henry, you've gone too far." Henry crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze unwavering. "What are you forbidding me from doing this time? You've become too entangled in this relationship, and I cannot allow it to continue. It's time for you to make a choice." Her voice was sharp, unyielding. "What do you mean?" Henry asked. Lady Whitmore rose from her seat and stepped closer to him. "You have 2 choices, Henry." She spoke each word with careful precision. "You marry Charlotte and keep everything that belongs to you, the company, the family name, the wealth." She paused, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "Or you continue to chase after Beatrice and lose it all." Silence filled the room. Henry stared at his mother, and in that moment he understood. This was no idle threat. If he chose Beatrice, he would lose his inheritance, his position, even his family. But he also realized something far more important. He couldn't trade love for the illusion of security. Henry took a deep breath, then replied, his voice calm and steady, "You can keep all of it, Lady Whitmore's expression faltered. She had not expected this. Henry, what are you saying? He met her gaze without hesitation. I won't marry Charlotte. I don't need the family fortune. If I have to choose, I choose Beatrice. He chose her, and she chose him. Less than a week later, Henry officially resigned from his position at Whitmore and Sons. He knew his decision would send shockwaves through the financial world, but he didn't care. When Beatrice heard the news, she rushed to find him, panic evident on her face. Henry, you can't do this. I can. Henry smiled, his eyes unwavering. I don't need a billion-dollar company if I can't have you in my life. Tears welled up in Beatrice's eyes, hot and uncontrollable. She had never imagined Henry would be willing to give up everything for her. You're such an idiot, she whispered. Henry chuckled softly, brushing his fingers against her cheek. If being an idiot means I get to be with you, then I gladly accept it. And for the first time, Beatrice didn't run away. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Because this time, Henry had chosen her, and she had chosen him. A love that withstood time. Winter slowly faded, leaving behind crisp air and warm golden light stretching along the Thames. Beatrice and Henry walked slowly along the old cobblestone path by the quiet river. The wind played with Beatrice's hair, and Henry instinctively tightened his grip on her hand, as if afraid that if he let go, she would disappear. They had come so far, from children running wild through the fields of Oxfordshire, to years of separation, to the trials that had led them here. Beatrice looked up at him, her blue eyes shining under the streetlights. Are you okay? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry smiled, soft, teasing, but also filled with a quiet relief. I have nothing left. His deep voice held no regret. Beatrice paused for a moment, then she smiled, a smile full of warmth and certainty. You have me. And in that instant, Henry dropped to one knee, right there on the cobbled path beside the river, where they had once played as children. Beatrice's breath hitched. From his pocket, Henry pulled out a small velvet box. Not a lavish diamond ring, but a simple silver band, engraved inside with 4 words, My forever, my home. I lost you once, Henry said gently, but this time, I won't let it happen again. I don't have a billion-dollar empire anymore. I don't have a title, but I have one thing I am more certain of than anything else. I have you. Beatrice, will you stay with me? Not because of who I used to be, but because of who I am, the man who loves you. Beatrice couldn't stop the tears. She didn't need wealth. She didn't need power. She just needed him. Yes. Henry laughed, slipping the ring onto her slender finger. She was no longer the girl afraid of distance. Now she was ready to stay, forever. A wedding full of love. They had a small, intimate wedding, nothing extravagant, nothing ostentatious. Horizon became their wedding venue, not in a grand ballroom, but right in the center's little garden, where children ran around holding flowers in their tiny hands. Beatrice wore a simple yet elegant white dress, while Henry opted for a relaxed suit. They exchanged vows beneath the soft glow of string lights, surrounded by laughter and the genuine joy of those who truly loved them. And when they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, Horizon erupted with cheers and applause. The children tugged at Beatrice and Henry's hands, dancing around them, a pure and innocent blessing unlike any other. Henry leaned down and whispered into Beatrice's ear, Today, I didn't just marry you. I married Horizon too. Beatrice laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. So, do you regret it? Henry shook his head, his smile radiant. Not for a second. A new beginning. After the wedding, Henry and Beatrice poured their hearts into Horizon. Henry used his business expertise and connections to expand the center, securing more funding and launching new projects to support street children. Together, they worked side by side, creating change, replicating Horizon's model in other cities. Their life was no longer lavish. No elite parties, no extravagant dinners in Michelin-starred restaurants. But every morning they woke up beside each other. Every day they walked hand in hand on the path they had chosen was a life full and complete. And then one day, a tiny miracle entered their lives. When Beatrice gave birth to their first son, Henry couldn't hold back his tears of joy. Holding the tiny baby in his arms, Feeling the small heartbeat pulsing in his hands, he realized this was the greatest treasure he had ever had. They named him Theo Whitmore, a symbol of their love and hope. Beatrice looked at Henry, her eyes filled with love. "You once had everything," Henry murmured, his gaze never leaving their child. "But now, I finally have everything." Beatrice squeezed his hand gently and rested her head on his shoulder, feeling more complete than ever. A mother's acceptance. Henry had believed his mother would never forgive him. But on a winter day, as snow blanketed the road in front of Horizon, a black Rolls-Royce pulled up quietly at the entrance. Lady Whitmore stepped out, poised as ever, though there was no longer sharpness in her eyes. She saw Beatrice holding Theo, Henry standing beside them, his face filled with happiness. She remained silent for a long time before finally speaking, her voice lower, carrying an emotion Henry had never heard before. "Henry, I think it's time for me to accept things as they are." Henry gently squeezed Beatrice's hand. Lady Whitmore turned to Beatrice, her gaze firm but no longer distant. "Beatrice, perhaps I was wrong about you." Beatrice smiled softly, sensing an invisible wall finally breaking. Lady Whitmore then looked at the small child in Beatrice's arms and reached out a hesitant hand. Theo grasped her finger, tight as if he too was accepting her. And in that moment, everything changed, forever together. On the banks of the Thames, where it had all begun, Henry and Beatrice walked hand in hand, guiding little Theo along the cobbled path beneath the fading sunset. Henry leaned down, pressing a kiss to Beatrice's forehead, and whispered, "We once lost each other." Beatrice smiled, gripping his hand tighter. "But this time, we'll never let that happen again." And so they walked forward, no longer afraid of the past, no longer anxious about the future, because finally they had each other. Forever. True love is a choice. Love isn't just about shared history, it's about choosing each other in the present. Beatrice and Henry had spent 10 years apart, but what brought them back together wasn't nostalgia. It was the love that had never faded. The greatest barrier in love isn't wealth or status, it's doubt. Beatrice feared they came from different worlds, but Henry's unwavering determination proved that love knows no limits. Sometimes we have to fight for our happiness, face our past, and choose what truly matters. Happiness isn't perfection, it's walking together, overcoming trials, and building a future more meaningful than anything that was lost. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together. Perched atop the highest hill in the city, the Reed Estate is a magnificent architectural masterpiece, where transparent glass walls reflect the fiery red sunset that seems to scorch the entire sky. Surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens, the mansion is not only a symbol of wealth, but also an impregnable fortress of isolation. Marble steps lead into the expansive foyer, where an extravagant crystal chandelier hangs from the soaring ceiling. Everything within the mansion exudes sophistication and power, yet it is so cold that no one could ever find true warmth here. The glass walls allow those inside to view the entire city spread out beneath them, but no one, other than Richard Reed, is there to enjoy the view. Simply put, the mansion has never truly known life. Richard Reed, the master of the estate, is a man who has always kept control of everything in his hands. At 32, he is the CEO of Reed Enterprises, a colossal conglomerate in finance and real estate, with thousands of employees under his command. In the business world, he is known as the man with a heart of stone because he has never lost a deal, never allowed anyone to read his thoughts, and above all, never let his emotions sway his decisions. Cold, sharp, calculating. That is how people describe Richard Reed. Love, that is a luxury he believes is not meant for him. There was a time when Richard believed in love, but it was mercilessly destroyed by the very woman he thought would walk with him until the end of his days. Veronica Bennett, The only woman who had ever entered his heart, betrayed him without hesitation, choosing another man, a wealthier, more powerful businessman who was ready to buy her with things Richard never offered, flattery and empty sweet words. The day he uncovered the truth, Richard realized one thing. Love is not worth anything. It is just a foolish transaction in which the one who believes in it will always be the loser. And Richard Reed never loses. From that moment on, he locked away his heart, allowing no one to enter and giving no one the chance to control him through emotions. For Richard, the world only had two types of people: the ones who control, the ones who are controlled, and he was always the one in control. He controlled the company, the deals, the people, and even his own life. Everything was part of a plan, with no surprises, no unnecessary emotions, and especially, no one could ever make Richard Reed lose control. In another corner of the estate, a completely different woman had just stepped in. Vanessa Monroe, 24 years old, was not the type of woman easily subdued by power or wealth. She was intelligent, sharp, witty, and most importantly, she never let anyone dictate her life. She had just taken a job as a maid in the Reed estate, a trial run for her own personal experiments in life. But within just a week, Vanessa had discovered something interesting about her employer. Richard Reed was not the terrifying man people made him out to be. Was he rich? Certainly powerful, of course. But was he the most enigmatic person she had ever encountered? Not exactly. In fact, Vanessa felt that Richard was more like a robot programmed for success, yet had forgotten how to truly live. And that intrigued her. A vast room, bathed in the warm glow of golden lights, reflected in the shimmering glasses of wine, expensive suits, and calculating smiles. The soft strains of jazz drifted through the conversations about markets, stocks, and power. This wasn't just a social gathering. It was where the rich and powerful challenged each other through the most intricate games. At the bar, Richard Reed stood alone, sipping his usual glass of whiskey. His cold gaze swept over the crowd, but he wasn't truly paying attention to anything. Parties like this were no different from a chessboard, where the pieces moved according to a set of rules, and he was always the one controlling the game. There had never been an exception. A familiar voice broke through his thoughts. "You think you can control everything in your life, don't you?" Richard didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Damian Carter was Richard's best friend and also his rival, a successful businessman whose only passion was watching Richard lose. The two of them had bet millions of dollars before on stocks, markets, business deals, but Damian had never managed to make Richard truly fail. And so, at a lavish party in the Reed estate, Damian came up with a special bet, a game not just about money, but about the one thing Richard hated most: love. A smile, unmistakably his, tugged at Damian's lips. The kind of smile that appeared whenever he was about to propose some crazy bet. Richard set his glass down, still not bothering to look at him. "Depends on what it is." Damian raised an eyebrow, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Then let's bet." Only then did Richard turn to face him, his sharp gaze as calm as ever. "This time, what is it? Stocks? A multi-million-dollar deal?" Damian shook his head, offering a faint smirk. "Number this time, it's women." The words made Richard pause for a moment, not because he was shocked, but because he despised games involving emotions. Still, he asked calmly, "Specifically?" Damian raised his glass, his tone as if he'd just thought of the most enticing game ever. "If you can control a simple woman, turn her into a perfect wife in 3 months, I'll give you $3 million. Richard smirked. "Easy." Damian shook his head, his eyes sharp as razors. "But if you fall in love with her before the 3 months are up, you'll lose $3 million to me." Richard laughed, shaking his head with disdain. "I never fall in love." Both of them turned to look at Vanessa, the new maid of the estate. For Richard, this game was over before it even began, or at least that's what he thought. "Interesting." Suddenly a voice rang out from behind. Both turned around, and there stood Vanessa Monroe. Her arms were crossed over her chest, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "A high-stakes game like this? And you didn't invite me to join? How hurtful." She didn't seem like the kind of woman who feared power. No hesitation, no shock or outrage, just pure mischief and intrigue. Her eyes were sharp, sparkling as though she had anticipated everything from the start. Damien laughed, crossing his arms over his chest. So, are you daring enough to join? Vanessa shrugged, taking a sip of champagne before slowly replying. Why not? I'm quite curious to see how a cold CEO handles it when he realizes he's losing at his own game. Richard felt a strange shiver run through him. Not because of the bet, but because of the way Vanessa was looking directly at him with eyes that showed no fear. He had met many women in his life, the seductive ones, the scheming ones, the ones who feigned innocence. But no one had ever looked at him like that. Not hesitant, not cautious, not overpowered by his authority. She knew exactly what she was doing, and that made Richard uncomfortable. Damien broke the silence with an excited laugh. All right, here's what I'll do. I'll tweak the rules a bit. Both of them looked at him with curiosity. Damien smirked, his tone stretched with triumph. If Richard falls in love with you first, he'll lose $3 million. But this time, the money won't just go to me. I'll only take $1 million. The remaining $2 million, Vanessa, will be yours. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, her gaze flickering with amusement. You're turning me into a prize now? Damien burst out laughing. Number, I'm just making the game more interesting. Now you have a huge incentive to make Richard fall for you, don't you think? Vanessa laughed softly. To be fair, I was going to do that from the start. Her response made Richard pause for a second. No one had said she had to participate. No one had forced her, but she had willingly entered this game, fully in control of her own decision. And that was what made him most uneasy. He was supposed to be the one controlling the game. But in that very moment, looking straight into Vanessa's eyes, Richard had a sinking feeling. The game had officially begun. And for the first time in his life, Richard Reed was uncertain about the outcome. Because for the first time, he didn't know who was truly in control of the game. Welcome to Soul Stories Poker. Life can be overwhelming, but here, we share heartfelt tales to bring you peace, joy, and inspiration. Your support, every comment, like, and follow, means the world to us. It motivates us to create more meaningful and uplifting stories just for you. Did our latest story touch your heart? Leave a "I am happy" in the comments if you agree. Subscribe now and be part of a community that spreads love, kindness, and positivity. Let's make every day a little brighter together. The wedding of Richard Reed and Vanessa Monroe was held at the Grand Royal Hotel, a place so exclusive that only the most powerful and wealthy families could step foot inside. White roses lined the aisle, gold-trimmed chairs were arranged neatly, and the light from hundreds of crystal chandeliers cascaded down, creating a stunning yet cold atmosphere. Just like the nature of this marriage, there were no sweet words of love, no gentle gazes or tender touches, only a $3 million bet and a game with an unclear winner. The ceremony proceeded smoothly to the point of boredom until the vows were about to be exchanged. Vanessa was supposed to simply answer with one word, "I do." But instead of letting the ceremony pass like a formality, she stepped forward, took the microphone from the host, and with a mischievous smile she spoke. "I'm not sure if I can be a perfect wife." The entire room went silent. Richard glared at her, surprised though not entirely uncomfortable. All the guests, from powerful business tycoons and billionaires to the media, turned their attention to the new bride. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her eyes mischievously scanning the room before continuing. "But I'll definitely be an interesting wife." A beat of silence. Then laughter erupted throughout the hall. The guests, accustomed to arranged marriages, couldn't help but be drawn in by this bold and arrogant declaration. Damien, the one who had initiated the game, laughed heartily, raising his glass in a toast. "This marriage looks more interesting than I thought." Meanwhile, Richard stood still, his gaze growing sharper, but deep down, there was a strange feeling, a sense of something like enjoyment. He hadn't expected her to break the script. She wasn't a puppet he could control at will. As Vanessa stepped down from the stage, she turned to look at Richard, giving him a playful wink. "Did you like my vows?" Richard furrowed his brows, his voice low and warning. Are you trying to cause trouble on our first day? Vanessa smiled faintly and shrugged. No, I'm just making sure everyone will remember this wedding. Don't you think so? Richard reached out, his hand sliding to her waist to guide her out of the ceremony hall, but Vanessa leaned in, whispering in his ear. You know, I think this game would be a lot more fun if you tried to be a little romantic. Richard tightened his grip, not out of anger, but because of the strange feeling that was creeping inside him. He was used to women trying to please him, trying to keep up a perfect facade to become the ideal wife. But Vanessa had no intention of doing that. The party continued with fine wine, soft music, and conversations about billion-dollar deals. Vanessa wasn't sitting beside Richard like a typical bride. She walked around chatting with the guests, making them laugh with her witty remarks. She drew attention effortlessly without even trying. Meanwhile, Richard sat at the main table, silently observing. She wasn't the type of woman who chased after wealth. She didn't shy away from power. She wasn't trying to win his favor. And that, in a strange way, made Richard feel uneasy. Go kiss the bride. In the middle of the party, Damien raised his glass and tapped it lightly with his finger, his voice full of excitement. Kiss the bride, Richard. Let's see if you can be the perfect husband. Applause erupted from the eager guests who were waiting to see this little performance. Vanessa tilted her head, looking at Richard with a provocative gleam in her eyes. So, darling? Are you up for it? Richard didn't like being put on the spot. He placed his glass down, gripped her waist, and pulled her closer. Vanessa didn't step back. She looked straight into his eyes, her half-smile still in place. Richard leaned down, but just as his lips were about to touch hers, Vanessa suddenly turned her head, avoiding the kiss, then whispered in his ear, Not so fast. I prefer to drag the game out a little longer. She stepped back, flashing a bright smile at the guests as though she had just successfully teased Richard. Damien laughed loudly while the other guests joined in, amused. Inside, Richard felt something stir, an almost imperceptible yet undeniable sense of losing control. She was running the game right in front of him, and that made him feel both frustrated and dangerously intrigued. As the party came to an end, Richard escorted Vanessa to the car, driving her back to the Reed estate where they would officially begin their 3-month marriage. He sat beside her in silence for a long while before finally speaking. I don't know what you're trying to do, but remember this, Vanessa. I'm the one who controls this game. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, turned to face him, and let out a soft chuckle. Oh? Well, I think we should wait and see until 3 months from now. I've already planned to spend that $2 million. The car sped off into the night, carrying two people with two very different goals. Richard wanted to prove he could control Vanessa. Vanessa wanted to prove that no one could control her. The real psychological game had officially begun. The Reed estate had never shown any sign of real life. Long hallways were lit by cold, distant lights. The glass walls were so perfect, they seemed untouched by dust. Every piece of furniture exuded opulence but lacked warmth, just like its owner. But ever since Vanessa Monroe stepped into the house, things began to change. It wasn't noisy or chaotic, but slowly, the Reed estate started to feel alive in a way Richard couldn't quite explain. And the worst part? He couldn't control it. Richard was a workaholic. Even after the wedding, he still spent most of his time in the office, avoiding any unnecessary emotions, just like he had done for years. But Vanessa wasn't the type of woman who would just let him do that. One night, when the lights in the office were still on late into the night, Vanessa suddenly pushed the door open and walked in. Without a word, she grabbed a pillow and threw it straight at his head. Go to sleep or I'll charge you for private health care. Richard looked up, frowning. What did you just do? Vanessa shrugged, leaning her hands on his desk. I just saved the CEO of a billion-dollar company from a stroke by overworking himself. You should thank me. Richard smirked, but instead of arguing, he grabbed the pillow, set it aside, and went back to his work. Vanessa shook her head, then placed a tray of food on the desk. I figured you'd be this stubborn, so I came prepared. Drink this with some seed milk. For Richard, business parties were opportunities to maintain his image and seal billion-dollar deals. But there was one thing he forgot. Vanessa wasn't the type of woman to follow the script. At a grand gala, as the two of them made their entrance in front of hundreds of guests, the journalists surrounded them, waiting for some tender moment to capture. Vanessa leaned in close to his ear, her voice laced with mischief. If anyone asks why we got married, I'll say it's because you owe me $2 million and you're selling yourself to pay off your debt. Richard froze for a second before turning to look at her, his eyes full of warning. You dare! Vanessa smirked, but before she could say anything more, a reporter approached. Mr. Reed, could you share the reason why you chose to marry Vanessa Monroe? The entire room fell silent, all eyes fixed on them. Vanessa smiled lightly, raising an eyebrow as she looked at Richard, waiting to see how he would respond. He felt his palms tighten, but then his lips curled into a cold smile. She's the most interesting woman I've ever met. Not words of love, not flowery speeches, but enough to make the entire room erupt in intrigued amusement. Vanessa nodded, seeming satisfied. Nice lie. I'll give you an 8 out of 10. Richard never expected that. With his answer, for the first time in his life, a woman would make him feel like he had to be on guard in his own game. One day, Richard placed an unlimited black card on the table and slid it toward Vanessa. You can buy anything you want. He thought she would happily take it, just like all the other women. But Vanessa glanced at it for a second, then picked it up, twirling it in her hand before handing it back to him. Thanks, but I prefer spending money I earn myself. Richard blinked. She refused? Vanessa smiled softly, propping her chin up as she looked at him. But don't worry, I'll get my $2 million from you sooner or later. Richard felt something stir inside him, not because of the money, but because of her unpredictability. Vanessa wasn't under his control. On the contrary, he was being swept up by his own rhythm of life. She wasn't trying to win him over, but she wasn't letting him manipulate her emotions either. She lived in his mansion as if it were her own, and more than that, she was changing him in some way. And the most dangerous part? He liked it. He began to look forward to her teasing. He started to feel uneasy when she wasn't around. He began to feel out of control. And that was something Richard couldn't accept. Richard Reed didn't have the habit of eating dinner at home. Most of the time, he ate at the office. A quick dinner, sometimes just a cup of coffee, and then he'd continue working late into the night. To him, food wasn't something important. Only work mattered. Only power mattered. Only the numbers he needed to control. But tonight, for some reason, he came home early. He wasn't exactly sure why. Maybe because he finished his work ahead of schedule. Maybe because the final meeting had been canceled. Or maybe because of a scent that wafted through the mansion as soon as he walked through the door. Richard didn't spend time in the kitchen. To him, it was a space for the staff, not somewhere he needed to concern himself with. But tonight, his feet unconsciously led him in that direction. He stopped at the doorway, his gaze slowly scanning the scene before him. Vanessa stood in the large kitchen, a simple apron tied around her waist, one hand stirring food in a pan, while the other lifted the lid of a pot to check on it. The aroma filled the air, enveloping the space like some kind of magic. It wasn't like any dish he'd ever tasted in Michelin-starred restaurants. It wasn't the luxurious, elaborate meals that the upper class often served at banquets. It was a warm, familiar scent, something that reminded him of the concept of home, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Vanessa sensed his presence, but she didn't turn around right away. Instead, she continued cooking, her voice calm. You're home early? I'm guessing it's not because you missed me? Richard crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, raising an eyebrow as he looked at her. I don't have the habit of eating dinner at home. Vanessa smiled softly, taking 2 plates from the kitchen cabinet and serving the food. Yeah, I know. The butler said you almost never have dinner here. She turned around, setting 1 plate on the table with a challenging look in her eyes. But tonight, I made a bit more. You should try it. Richard glanced at the dish on the table. It looked simpler than the kind of meals he was used to seeing at lavish banquets. No caviar, no truffle sauce, no expensive ingredients used to flaunt wealth. Just a steaming plate of pasta with a creamy sauce and fresh seafood. He could smell the rich, savory scent. A hint of butter, garlic, and something he couldn't quite name. But he had no reason to sit down. He wasn't hungry, so he simply shrugged, his tone indifferent. I'm not hungry. Vanessa wasn't surprised by his response. She slowly placed the fork on the table, crossing her arms in front of her chest, tilting her head as she looked at him, her eyes glinting with a challenge. "Oh, CEO Richard Reed is turning down a free meal? How unfortunate." Richard smirked. "What are you trying to do?" Vanessa took a step closer, pulled a spoon from the drawer, scooped up some of the sauce, and held it out in front of him. "Try it. If you don't like it, I'll leave the kitchen immediately." Richard stared at her. Was she playing with him? He'd met countless women in his life, but none had made him feel like he was the one being manipulated in this game. He wanted to decline again, but the aroma of the dish was genuinely making him second-guess himself. And the worst part, he was actually curious. Finally, without saying another word, Richard bent down, slowly tasting the sauce. 1 second, 2 seconds. Vanessa leaned on her hand, smiling lightly, as if she had already anticipated the outcome. Richard didn't say anything, only slowly licking his lips, as if savoring the lingering taste. And that was when Vanessa knew. She had won. She took a step back, leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing her arms with a teasing tone. "Is it so delicious that you can't even speak?" Richard glanced at her, his expression somewhat perplexed. She knew how to challenge him. She knew how to make him lose control. She knew how to turn the tables without using money or power. And now, she even made him want to come home just for a simple meal. Dangerous. Too dangerous. Vanessa smiled softly, tilting her head as she looked at him, her voice laced with meaning. "If I can make you addicted to my food, then other things won't be so hard, will they?" Richard felt something inside him starting to crumble, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he still had control over this game, because Vanessa Monroe had turned him into her addict in a way he couldn't resist. Richard had always been in control. He could predict every move, kept himself detached from emotions, and most importantly, he never felt jealousy. Jealousy was a weakness, a feeling for the weak. At least, that's what he thought before Vanessa stepped into his life. She didn't try to win him over, didn't pretend to be obedient, didn't fear him. She was free, captivating, and the most dangerous part, she belonged to no one. That night, a grand business event took place at the Grand Imperial Hotel, gathering the most powerful figures in finance. Richard arrived with work on his mind, but for the first time, his focus wasn't entirely on deals. His attention was on one person, Vanessa. She didn't walk beside him as a dutiful wife. Instead, she moved freely around the room, chatting with people with an effortless confidence. That made her more dangerous than anyone. Richard didn't like this. But the real irritation flared when he saw a man standing too close to her. Far too close. Daniel Hart, a promising young entrepreneur, was laughing with Vanessa in a way that Richard couldn't accept. He leaned in, whispering something in her ear, making her laugh. Richard gripped his glass tighter, feeling a heat spread throughout his body. What the hell was he doing? She was just part of the bet, just a game. There was no reason for him to feel uncomfortable. But then Vanessa suddenly turned and looked at him, as if she could feel his gaze from across the room. And just before Daniel could say anything more, Vanessa did something Richard never expected. She walked over, one arm wrapping around him, leaning slightly into his chest in front of everyone, smiling brightly as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Sorry, buddy, but I've already bet on this guy." Daniel blinked, surprised, but quickly laughed. "Oh, looks like Richard's the lucky one." But Richard didn't hear anything else. The entire room seemed to blur for a moment, because the feeling that hug gave him disoriented him. She wasn't acting, or at least, if this was an act, she was performing it so well that he couldn't tell what was real and what was fake. His heart raced. He didn't like this. The party ended, and they returned to the Reed mansion, but Richard couldn't sleep. He sat by the bed quietly watching Vanessa sleep beside him. The dim light from the night lamp cast a soft glow on her face, making her features appear even softer and more serene than usual. No mischievous smile, no sharp remarks, just a woman lying there in his world. And that was when he realized the harshest truth. He had lost, not in business, not in some billion-dollar deal, But in the very game that he himself had set the rules for, he had fallen for her. The woman who was sometimes playful, sometimes soft, sometimes gentle, who had pulled him in ways that were uncontrollable and unpredictable. He had lost himself. He was no longer Richard Reed, the cold, emotionless man. He had completely lost control around Vanessa. And the most important thing? He didn't want to control her anymore. He just wanted her beside him, not for the game, not for the money, but for her. For the first time, Richard was afraid. He had lost love once before in his life, and he had sworn never to let that happen again. But this time, if he lost Vanessa, he wasn't sure he could face himself anymore. He reached out, gently touching the soft strands of her hair. "What have you done to me, Vanessa?" No answer. Only the steady rhythm of her breathing and an unchangeable truth. He had fallen in love with her. That morning, the Reed mansion was unusually quiet. There was no sound of water running from the bathroom, no hint of coffee drifting from the kitchen, no soft footsteps echoing down the hallway, no mischievous laughter, no familiar teasing words, only an endless emptiness. Richard woke up, instinctively reaching out to the side of the bed. But it was cold. Vanessa wasn't there. A cold shiver ran down his spine, something unclear, but terrifying enough to make him immediately sit up. He quickly got out of bed and rushed to the closet. No sign of her clothes. He ran downstairs to the living room. No trace of her. The kitchen. No breakfast waiting for him. She was gone. No goodbye, no note, no explanation. She had vanished. Richard pulled out his phone and quickly dialed her number. "The number you have dialed is currently unavailable." The familiar message echoed in the silence, but this time it felt like more than just an innocent announcement. It felt like a knife stabbing straight into his chest. He dialed again, the second time, the third, the 10th, still no response. A real sense of panic began to squeeze his mind. He frantically searched the mansion, as if she were just hiding somewhere, as if he searched long enough, she would appear in front of him. "Vanessa!" No one answered. No text message. No note left behind. Not a single sign that she had ever existed in his world. She had disappeared like the wind. Richard couldn't accept it. He mobilized all his resources to find Vanessa. He called Damien. Where did she go? Damien, the one who was always teasing and mocking him. But today, he sighed. "I don't know, Richard. She didn't tell me. But I guess she left because you won." Richard gripped the phone tightly, his chest tightening. "No way. She can't just disappear like this." Damien chuckled dryly, but his voice carried a harsh truth this time. "Why not? Did you never consider the possibility that Vanessa might actually win this game?" Richard hung up the phone immediately. He refused to believe it. He refused to accept that he had lost. He called in a private investigation team. He scoured every security camera, checked every bank account, and searched for any trace that might lead him to her. But everything was empty. Nothing. No financial transactions. No flight tickets. No one had seen her. Vanessa had disappeared as though she had never existed. For the first time in his life, money and power couldn't get him what he truly wanted. For the first time, Richard Reed realized that he was completely powerless. He tried to bury himself in work. He stayed late at the office, signing contract after contract. He reminded himself, "I lived without her before. I can keep going." But when he returned to the Reed mansion, the place that had once been his kingdom to control, it was empty. No more warm dinners that Vanessa used to cook for him. No more mischievous teasing that drove him crazy. No more her. Just Richard, a loser in his own game. Richard sat down on the sofa where Vanessa used to curl up with a book every night. He closed his eyes, recalling the image of her bright smile when she teased him and made him uncomfortable. He could still smell the faint scent lingering on the pillow she used. He remembered her voice. He remembered her eyes. He remembered the gentle embrace she'd give him every time he came home. And that was when the pain erupted. For the first time in his life, Richard felt an emptiness that nothing could fill. For the first time in his life, he couldn't control himself. For the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. His first love had left him before, and he had thought that was the greatest pain he'd ever endured. But this pain was 100 times worse. Because Vanessa hadn't just entered his life, she had become a part of him. And now she was gone. Richard leaned back, staring at the ceiling. She was supposed to leave. He was supposed to win. He should be happy, but he felt nothing. Money no longer mattered. Power no longer had any meaning, because the one thing he truly wanted to have back had disappeared. He had lost, not just $3 million, but his own heart. And for the first time, Richard Reed understood what it truly meant to lose everything. It had been a week since Vanessa left. The Reed estate had returned to its usual silence, except this time, it wasn't peace, but an emptiness that couldn't be filled. There were no soft footsteps echoing through the halls, no playful jabs that made him lose control, no hot meal waiting for him at the end of the day. Only Richard Reed, a man who had lost in the game he himself created. He had searched everywhere, used all of his connections, but there was still no trace of Vanessa. For the first time, Richard truly felt the weight of loss, and the only thing he could do was wait hopelessly. That morning, a light rain cast a dull gray over the Reed estate. Richard sat in his office, his lifeless gaze fixed on the pile of paperwork in front of him, but not a single line registered in his mind. Then, knock, knock. A knock echoed from the door. He didn't react. But then the butler's voice came from the other side, filled with an unusual surprise. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." Richard still didn't respond. There was no one he wanted to see right now. But then a voice rang out, the one voice that could make his heart stop for a second. "Good morning, my love. Aren't you going to open the door?" The world seemed to shatter. Richard sprang to his feet, stunned. He rushed to the door, nearly forgetting to breathe. And as soon as the door swung open, Vanessa was standing there, slightly wet from the morning rain, her hair loose and natural, yet still wearing that mischievous smile that drove him wild. She had come back. She was here. She was really here. Vanessa Monroe, the woman who had disappeared from his life for the past week, leaving him with days that felt meaningless and an emptiness that nothing could fill, was standing right in front of him. Richard couldn't believe it. For the first time in his life, he feared this might be an illusion, a cruel joke his mind was playing after days of desperate searching for her. But no, she was standing there, right outside the estate, her familiar blue eyes staring directly at him. His breath caught, his heart clenched in pain. Richard didn't think. He didn't care why she had come back. He didn't care if she was going to leave again. He didn't care about any reason. All he knew was one thing. He couldn't lose her again. Without a word, without hesitation, he stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, held her tight, as if afraid that if he let go, she would vanish instantly. Her warmth made him tremble. Her scent was so familiar it hurt. Her heartbeat quickened beneath his hand. It wasn't an illusion. She was truly back. Richard held her even tighter, burying his face in her hair, breathing in deeply, as if trying to engrave this moment into every cell of his body. His voice cracked, breaking, as the emotions that had been buried for the past week finally burst out. "I was wrong, Vanessa. I was wrong about everything." His breath shuddered, his whole body overwhelmed by a mix of pain and relief. "Please, give me a chance to love you, not because of a contract, not because of a bet, but because I truly love you." He spoke each word as if he didn't say it now, he would lose the only chance he would ever have in his life. For the first time, Richard Reed, the man who never showed emotion, the man who never admitted defeat, had completely surrendered to love. She didn't push him away. She didn't reject him. She didn't mock him for showing weakness. For the first time, Richard thought that maybe, just maybe, she finally understood how serious he was. She stayed silent for a few seconds, letting him hold her tight, as if she, too, could feel all the pain, longing, and desperation he had been through these past days. Yes, Vanessa was back. He had thought this was a victory, but then she lifted her head. Her familiar blue eyes sparkled with a mischievous glint. And then she laughed. "Are you sure? Because I remember you owe me $2 million. Richard stood frozen. For a moment, he couldn't process the words he'd just heard. "I owe her?" Right. The game. The betting rules. $2 million. He had lost. and she remembered that better than anyone. Richard felt his jaw tighten, his eyes darken with a complex mix of emotions. Is she joking with me? For the past week, he had gone insane over her, searching everywhere, feeling as if the world had fallen apart when she disappeared. And now, when he finally found her, the first thing she says is to demand payment? He clenched his jaw, his breath coming faster as he tried to calm the anger rising within him. Really, Vanessa? I'm begging for your love, and you're talking about money? Vanessa raised an eyebrow, crossed her arms, and her gaze was full of challenge. The rules of the game are still in effect, right? Richard glared at her, his chest heaving with frustration. She really could drive him crazy, literally. No woman on this earth could make Richard Reed, the cold-hearted CEO with absolute control, lose his composure like this. But Vanessa could. And the most dangerous part, she knew it. He gave a powerless laugh, nothing surprising. Of course, she was still Vanessa Monroe. Still the only woman in the world who could make him lose control. Still the only one who could make him furious, and yet he couldn't stop loving her. He gritted his teeth, took a deep breath, and stepped back. Fine. No argument, no competition, no more trying to control this situation. If she wanted the $2 million, he would give it to her. He turned, walked into his office, opened a drawer, and took out a checkbook. He placed the pen on the paper, wrote down the amount, tore the check off, and handed it to her. Here, $2 million, just like you wanted. Richard stared at her, challenging her to take it. If this was the reason she came back, then take it. But deep down, he hoped she wouldn't. That everything wasn't just about a bet. That she didn't come back for the money. He wanted her back for him. But even if she did take the check, he would still hope she would give him one chance to love her. Vanessa glanced at the check in Richard's hand. It lay there, a clear testament to his defeat. $2 million. A sum that meant little to Richard Reed, but for a man who was used to controlling everything, being forced to write this check was a failure he had never anticipated. He stood there, eyes locked on her, shoulders tense, as though waiting for her to take the money and leave, waiting for her to prove that it was all just a game, waiting for her to crush his heart in the most brutal way. But Vanessa didn't do that. She didn't rush. She didn't explain. She didn't need to say much at all. Instead, she stepped closer, slowly but surely. Richard remained still, but his entire being seemed to be pulled toward her. With each step Vanessa took, his breath slowed, a feeling of both anticipation and unfamiliarity creeping into every fiber of his body. She raised her hand, gently brushing his cheek. Her finger glided lightly across his skin, warm, soft, but with an underlying danger. Richard felt the storm inside him rise with force. He had once controlled the world, but in this moment, he couldn't control himself. Vanessa softly tugged him down, her breath grazing his lips, so close it shattered every thought he had. No need for the money, she whispered, her voice softer than ever before. Richard stiffened. His heart pounded fiercely, as if it might burst out of his chest. But she didn't stop. She placed a finger over his lips, silencing any words he might have said. I only need you. Then she kissed him, not hurriedly, not hesitantly. There were no barriers between them anymore. The kiss ignited, passionate, carrying all the words that had never been spoken. Richard stood still, as if the entire world had stopped the moment her lips touched his. Outside, the rain might have been falling. A billion-dollar deal might have been waiting for him. A meeting might have been taking place, but nothing mattered anymore. Richard wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her closer, holding her tight as if she were the only thing that still existed in the world. She had entered his life like a storm. She had broken every rule he set. She had made him love in a way he couldn't control. And now she had won. He no longer cared about the game, no longer cared about the rules, no longer cared about anything else. He only cared about her, the one person he was willing to bet his entire life on. This time, there were no conditions, no 3-month contracts, no games. Only Richard and Vanessa, two people, two hearts, truly belonging to each other. They were starting over, like strangers discovering each other for the first time. But this time, there were no boundaries, no doubts, no calculations. Just evening walks under the city lights, where Richard held Vanessa's hand tightly, afraid of losing her again. Just warm dinners at the Reed estate, where Vanessa continued to cook in a way that made Richard addicted to her more than anything in the world. Just long conversations that stretched into the night, where Richard was no longer a cold CEO, but a man learning how to truly love. And above all, one thing was certain. They weren't playing games anymore. On a starry evening, Richard took Vanessa to a garden filled with warm golden lights. Not extravagant, not noisy, not needing the world to witness it. Only one person was needed, the one he loved more than himself. Richard knelt before her, without hesitation, offering a ring that shimmered with silver light. Not because of a bet, not because of a plan, not for any reason other than the purest love he had ever known. This time, there's no contract, no clauses, no 3-month term, no games. He looked her straight in the eye, his gaze full of sincerity. Only love, and I'm betting my whole life on you. Vanessa looked at him, her smile radiant, but her eyes glinted with a familiar, mischievous spark. She tilted her head slightly, pretending to think. No termination clause? Richard chuckled softly, gently squeezing her hand. Never. Vanessa looked at him for a long time, and then finally nodded. Then, I accept. Richard didn't wait another second. He stood up, pulled her into a tight embrace, and kissed her deeply, a kiss with no barriers left. Only a man loving a woman with all his heart. And for the first time in his life, Richard wasn't afraid of losing anymore, because he had won the most important thing. He had won Vanessa Monroe's love, and this time it was never going to be a game again. The lesson learned from this story is that true love cannot be bought with money, power, or anything else in the material world. Love is something that cannot be controlled or manipulated through games, contracts, or bets. It comes from the heart, from sincerity, from genuine emotions and mutual acceptance without conditions. Richard Reed, despite being a wealthy and powerful man, could not buy Vanessa's love with money or agreements. He had to learn to let go of control and understand that true love can only come when both parties are willing to give each other trust, affection, and sincerity. The story emphasizes that while we may achieve many things in life, when it comes to love, the most important thing is authenticity and true commitment. Love is not something that can be bound by terms or conditions. It is something that can only come when we are truly ready to open our hearts and accept another person as they are, without expecting anything in return. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.